He defrauded the entire French nation after the war, and in 1920, he made off with 3 million francs in public donations, yet no one could uncover his true identity because he wore a mask at all times, and this infamous wartime scandal was nothing more than a mad and stunning act of revenge he had orchestrated. Meant to mock this cruel and absurd world, the story begins with a military dog walking through the trenches. As 4 years of war had already left French soldiers in utter despair, Albert's face was full of killing intent, but he saw his comrade Edouard seriously sketching, and even his filthy face couldn't hide those jewel-like eyes. Edouard was never meant for the battlefield, and when a ceasefire order arrived, Captain Pradelle was the only one who wasn't pleased. In war, the more territory you seize, the better your promotion and wealth after the war. So he ignored orders from above and began telling the soldiers that dying today was more meaningful than dying yesterday. Captain Pradelle gave the order to attack, but no one wanted to fire their weapons anymore. Those who thought the war would soon end had all died early in the conflict, and as rumors of the ceasefire spread, everyone knew that dying last was far more foolish than dying first. Meanwhile, Edouard had finished his drawing, showing Albert a simple cartoon that mocked the captain as nothing more than a bloodthirsty demon of war. In the end, the demon won, and 2 young soldiers were forced to scout the front lines, even though they knew that doing so in broad daylight was suicidal. But an order was still an order. Little soldier Thoreau was shot dead after only a few steps, and Captain Pradelle had just found his excuse to start the attack. Smoke and fire covered the battlefield, and Albert and Edouard had no choice but to charge forward. Knowing only that they must not let fear control them, they had to keep running, outrun the corpses that littered the ground, outrun the crumbling earth. But here, human lives were as cheap as ants, and you never knew when the next shell would land on you. Albert was blown into the air and landed next to little Thoreau, only to find that the bullet which killed him had entered from the back, proving he had been shot by one of their own. Only then did he realize that some beasts have no tears, like the one standing before him, Captain Pradelle. The captain raised his gun, ready to silence Albert, the witness, but to escape the execution, Albert crawled into a crater, only to have a shell fall from the sky and bury him alive in dust and dirt. When Albert opened his eyes in the darkness, he saw a horse's head pressed against his face. Realizing he was in the same crater as a dead horse, he had fought to survive, and he couldn't accept being killed in such a despicable way. So he pried open the horse's mouth and greedily breathed in the foul air inside, buying Edouard enough time to rescue him. They were merely ordinary comrades, yet that didn't stop Edouard from ignoring the blood and chaos around him and using both hands to dig Albert out of his grave. Albert coughed out the stench of death in huge gulps, and before he could thank Edouard, a shard of shrapnel flew straight toward Edouard. The dice of fate had been cast, and Edouard's destiny was sealed. It was November 9th, 1918, just 2 days before the end of World War I.
Dat is toch echt Krieg.
Edouard survived, but a gaping, bloody hole was left on his face. He struggled to get up from the bed, using a metal tray as a mirror, and when he pulled off the gauze, the reflection showed a monster. He had lost his jaw, could no longer speak, and would be fed through a tube for the rest of his life. He suffered day and night from unbearable pain, and the heavy use of morphine for relief led to addiction, so the doctor always prescribed it sparingly, while the nurse pointed to the cross and said that even Jesus was still suffering. So Albert had no choice but to steal morphine and secretly inject it into Edouard's body, just as Edouard had once pulled him back from death. Now he used this shameful method to keep Edouard alive. He even turned the cross upside down, as if to say, if there really is a God, let him come and see this suffering. When Edouard finally woke up, he just stared at the window, thinking about ending it all by jumping, but after Albert closed the window, he never found the courage to try again, and he was forced to go on living. During that time, he often thought about where he came from. He had been the pride of heaven, born under his mother's love, with a playful sister and a stern, cold-faced father. His father was always on the phone, too busy to even say goodnight to his son. From a young age, Edouard showed an extraordinary talent for drawing, and with his mother's encouragement, he believed he was destined to become the greatest artist of the 20th century. But then heart disease took his mother away and shattered his entire world. He was still so young, always longing for a mother's kind of love, and if that wasn't possible, then just a simple hug. But his father gave him a banknote instead. Rumor had it that his father was wealthy beyond imagination, yet Edouard felt that he had nothing at all. Even as a boy, he learned to strike back, using his artistic talent to mock his father as a man who cared only about counting money. His father thought art was vulgar and indecent, something that would turn his son soft and weak. so he constantly rejected and belittled Edouard's passion, and so he endured until the age of 19, when war broke out, finally giving him a chance to escape the home that had imprisoned his soul. And before leaving, he stuck his tongue out at his father. To him, dying on the battlefield would be a kind of blessing. At least it meant he would never have to face that cold father again. Albert happened to step on a minefield and was ordered to escort Edouard to a hospital in Paris, where they would make him a fake jaw so he wouldn't scare his family when he returned home. Edouard struggled to write words.
Ton père était brun quand même.
Tears streaming down his face as he made muffled sounds, his throat gurgling like a circus monkey, and no one could tell what he was trying to say. Finally, he used hand gestures to beg Albert to end his life. Albert couldn't understand how someone who had survived the war could want to die because of his father, but fate had already bound the two of them together, and he had to save Edouard. At that time, too many soldiers had died, and the officers were overwhelmed, rushing to process the fallen soldiers' records. So the timid Albert gathered every ounce of courage he had and snuck into the records office, finding the file of a dead orphan and swapping his identity with Edouard's. From that moment, Edouard disappeared from the world, and an orphan with no family returned from death, haunted by guilt. Albert even wrote a letter to Edouard's family, telling them that Edouard had died heroically in battle, and enclosed one of his battlefield sketches as a keepsake. His sister wept uncontrollably, while Edouard's father didn't shed a single tear. Edouard was then sent to a hospital in Paris, where the doctors proposed several options, the simplest being to craft a few masks to cover the gaping hole in his face, or to invite renowned surgeons for multiple reconstructive operations. The doctors proudly discussed their success stories, saying that if the war had any benefit at all, it was the great progress made in facial reconstruction surgery. But Edouard rejected every option, because whether he wore a fake jaw or not, his fate was already sealed a hopeless end. Meanwhile, Albert was handling his discharge papers, and ironically, after 4 years of war, all he received was 52 francs of compensation and the old uniform he had to buy himself. The war had bankrupted the nation, and it had bankrupted him as well. Albert had no choice, and when he returned to civilian life, he was often met with cold stares because of his uniform. It took him a long time to realize that people believed only those who died in battle were heroes, and that those who returned alive were not. Then Captain Pradelle appeared before him again, and though Albert hid his fear and hatred, this time, Pradelle wanted him to meet Edouard's sister, Madeleine. Madeleine was willing to risk breaking the law just to bring her brother's body home, while Captain Pradelle hovered nearby, trying to win her favor. Madeleine herself wasn't particularly beautiful, but her dowry was considerable, and to Pradelle, a good marriage promised a lifetime of fortune. So even though he knew Edouard was still alive, he helped Albert keep the secret.
À 30 km d'ici, il y a le cimetière de Pierreval, le plus grand, le plus fourni. Un choix énorme. Tu trouves un macapé pour la sœur et on en reste là.
Albert soon found an unmarked grave and hung Edouard's military tag on it, successfully fooling Madeleine. But that also gave Captain Pradelle his chance, and from there, his entanglement with Madeleine began. The victory of the war marked the downfall of the soldiers' fates. Prices were rising everywhere, and the people lived in hardship. Albert, once an accountant, lost his position despite being a veteran, and with nowhere else to go, he rented a shabby attic in Paris, living with Edouard. Edouard's condition was terrible, and Albert even began researching terms like neurasthenia and depression, but none of them quite fit. Edouard was simply waiting quietly for death, and waiting for death had become his only way out. In addition to everything else, he became addicted to drugs, relying on morphine day and night just to stay alive. And for Albert, this became a huge financial burden. Finding money turned into his full-time job. Eventually, with no other option, he set his sights on other veterans, most of whom were disabled and relied on morphine to ease their pain. Every time Edouard had a withdrawal episode, it was like being eaten alive by a million ants, and Albert's heart would soften every time, forcing him to steal more morphine from disabled veterans. Surprisingly, this didn't require much moral struggle. The only thing war had truly taught him was how to become an enemy of the innocent. Meanwhile, Captain Pradelle was riding high on his glory, using his shiny war medals to land a contract for a military cemetery, offering reburial services and making a fortune from it. He hired a large number of cheap workers who couldn't read French, buried the bodies randomly, and when someone discovered that the remains didn't match the tombstones, he would resort to threats and bribes, quickly rising to success within a year. He had made $1 million and was driving the most expensive car of the time. Then one day, it was as if Edouard had heard a calling. He finally rose from the worn-out sofa. The landlord's young daughter, Louise, brought him a newspaper, and curiosity got the better of her. She wanted to see the face beneath the mask. After a long silence, Edouard pulled off his mask, expecting to frighten her away with his appearance, but Louise gently touched his scar. That simple gesture brought him to tears, and such deep sorrow could shatter anyone's soul. In that moment, the emptiness in his body and spirit was suddenly filled, and the newspaper Louise had brought revived him entirely. Albert came home, dejected, only to find a completely transformed Edouard.
Incroyable. T'es jolie. T'es jolie.
It was the first time Albert had smiled since the war, and he didn't even realize how long it had been since he truly exhaled from the heart. Edouard even gave him a gift, a dockworker's mask, but before Albert could be moved, he heard about a new plan. The newspaper said that everyone longed for a war memorial, and Edouard saw an opportunity in designing them. Albert tried to explain the workload behind such a project, but he quickly realized that Edouard had no intention of building real monuments. He just wanted to sell the design blueprints, take the advance payments, and disappear. Albert immediately refused. He didn't want to go to jail, but even that reason couldn't convince himself, because their current lives were no different from prison. Eventually, Albert revealed the real reason. He couldn't bear to profit off false war memorials. Such a scam desecrated something sacred and insulted his sense of patriotism. But Edouard thought he lacked courage, vengeance, and ruthlessness, which completely enraged Albert. He was torn between worrying that no one would care for Edouard and a silent resentment. He hated how Edouard had hijacked his life.
De toute façon, depuis 6 mois, qui c'est qui s'occupe de toi tout le temps? Qui te chauffe, qui te loge, qui te nourrit? Qui va se bagarrer avec les vendeurs de drogue pour trouver ta cam? Hein? Qui c'est qui t'a sorti des griffes de Pradel? Qui c'est qui t'a tué aux archives? Hein? Ça fait 6 mois que je suis enchaîné à toi avec les bêtises, là! T'es pire que la guerre, t'entends? T'es pire que la guerre!
The two of them came to blows, and Albert punched Edouard in the face, shattering a hole in his mask. Albert instantly came to his senses, while Edouard held his face and left. But Albert had to keep moving forward. He believed that as long as there was a new day, things could get better. He found work as an elevator operator, and on his 7th day, he happened to see his fiancée entering the elevator, arm in arm with a wealthy young man. He could even smell the most expensive perfume of the time on her, and had no idea how many months he'd have to work to afford a single bottle. In that moment, he understood why she had never written back to him those few minutes in the elevator felt longer than the time he spent in the crater with Edouard. When they got out, she took off her engagement ring and handed it to him. Albert didn't even wait to collect his 7 days' wages. He simply walked away. He then found work as a street hawker, hanging 2 advertisement boards on himself, shouting slogans in the street, until he was recognized by one of the veterans he had robbed for morphine. They quickly surrounded him and gave him a brutal beating, and in that moment, no one was truly in the wrong. It was the people who started the war who had drained the era of its soul, forcing society to turn cruel. Albert realized this far too late. That night, he returned home and covered his wounds with the horseface mask. The stench of oxygen inside the dead horse's mouth would haunt him for life. But he was also eternally grateful to that horse and that stench. They had given him a second chance at life. To Albert, Edouard was that same suffocating yet vital bond. So he went to Louise's house and brought Edouard back, agreeing to take part in Edouard's plan to sell fake war memorials. Edouard's tear-streaked face turned into a smile, and they both knew this was revenge. A final strike against a ridiculous world. When the monument rises, the guillotine rises with it. So something like this must be either abandoned forever or executed without hesitation. The 3 of them immediately sprang into action. Edouard was in charge of designing the fake memorials, which was a huge challenge for him, because the essence of a product is mediocrity, ugliness, and high price equals success, and Edouard was too gifted for mediocrity, which made the task even harder. He wore the mask of an academic old man all day, practicing how to make his drawings look bland and unremarkable, and then had young Louise bind them into portfolios. Albert's task was even heavier. He had to earn enough money to produce the promotional brochures and create the illusion of a legitimate front company. Hanging a couple of signs in the street and yelling like a vendor wouldn't lift them out of poverty even in 50 years. Just as he was racking his brain over money, money came knocking on his door. Edouard's father couldn't sleep at night. He couldn't tell whether it was missing his son that made him grow old so quickly, or if it was aging that finally brought on the longing. He kept flipping through Edouard's childhood photos, wondering if things would have been different had he offered a hug instead of a banknote. In that moment, maybe Edouard wouldn't have gone to war. Then he began looking at his son's drawings. Under each one was a small signature. In the past, he had never acknowledged Edouard's talent, but now he could easily sense the brilliance that had been there all along. For instance, Edouard had never drawn a corpse, but every lively soldier in his works was clearly marching toward death. The father asked to meet the comrade who had written the letter home, and so Madeline invited Albert over. Albert borrowed a decent-looking suit for the visit, but it was painfully clear that he wasn't prepared. He had never imagined Edouard came from such wealth. If he had that kind of money, who knows how many bottles of expensive perfume he could have bought for his fiancée. But Edouard had chosen to run wild with him rather than associate with this privileged world. Albert had barely taken his seat when he was shocked. Right there in the living room was a wedding photo of Madeline and Captain Pradelle. It was like a ghost story. If Edouard found out that his sister had married the bloodthirsty demon who ruined him, it would break his heart and possibly kill him all over again. Dinner was an ordeal for Albert. One lie about Edouard's death would have to be covered by 1,000 more. Luckily, Edouard's father didn't care much about what he said just by watching him devour his food. He knew life had been punishing this man, so before Albert left, the father formally invited him to work as an accountant at his bank. Back home, Albert brought it up jokingly, maybe they should rob Edouard's father and get their first windfall that way. Edouard immediately rejected the idea. His father had become rich by marrying into his mother's family, and his entire business empire had always profited from crises. Crises were custom-built moneymakers for men like him. To Edouard, his father was not just a thief of the household, but a thief of the entire nation. So Albert chose to keep the dinner visit a secret and decided instead to take the bank job and steal from within. He specifically targeted profiteers of the war economy, using the classic scam known as the Sci-Bridge trick. If a profiteer deposited 60,000 francs, Albert would enter 40,000 and skim off 20,000. If they deposited 20,000, he'd take 2,000. All the money would be routed through various accounts until it landed in one trusted account which Albert had stolen. The advantage of big banks was that until final reconciliation, nothing was noticed. Every asset was frozen for 3 days before being verified, and as long as Albert returned the missing funds within that window, he could keep playing the game. The tactic was like playing cat and mouse with the bank. It was exhausting, hence the name Sci-Bridge. But Albert had been in a state of high anxiety ever since the war, and not even peace had calmed his nerves. So this scheme came naturally to him. Once the embezzlement was successful, the fake monument brochures were ready. Edouard transformed into a masked Zorro, ready to run off with 3 million francs. The brochures were filled with war and death, everything Edouard despised, but now it was all being sold for cash, because he had sharply realized that in the current society, patriotism was the one thing everyone wanted to buy, and it had to be admitted. No matter how much Edouard wanted to cut ties with his father, he had inherited his business instincts. By contrast, Albert saw himself as hard-working but insignificant. He suddenly understood some people were born rich, and he was born not to be one of them. The first person to pay for a fake monument was Edouard's father. He organized a committee to launch a public bid to erect a monument in the city center with the names of every fallen soldier. He wanted Edouard's name to be immortalized, and he offered a price of 150,000 francs just for that one name. Albert didn't even bother setting up a real company. He rented a mailbox, and just before Bastille Day, the patriotic frenzy swept through, and he opened the mailbox to find himself drowning in orders. Each letter was an order. 3 million francs were within reach.
Incroyable. Je pensais que les gens étaient un peu bêtes, genre comme moi, mais à ce point-là.
Soon the first down payment arrived. After plugging the gap in the bank's books, Albert became a millionaire. The first thing he did was visit Louise's foster mother. Girls like Louise, orphans of war, were everywhere, and the woman immediately agreed to sell her daughter to Albert. For Albert, money was no longer an issue. Edouard, however, had no interest in wealth. He only bought some rum, which he injected into himself through a feeding tube. He even crafted a mask out of real banknotes. That was the extent of his desires. Albert planned to run off with the money on Bastille Day, crossing the sea to faraway Africa. Edouard, for once, was silent. His original plan had been only to make money and get revenge. He had never dared to think about the future, and now he couldn't avoid it. Then came something even worse. Edouard finally discovered that his sister had married Captain Pradelle, the very demon who turned him into a monster. Stealing 3 million couldn't shake him, but this news brought back the crying face mask. He used a dose of morphine to put himself into a deep sleep. A few days later, Edouard pulled himself together. He dressed in women's clothes and officially began his revenge against Captain Pradelle. The three of them went to the Ministry of Honor. After a few rounds of investigation, Edouard finally identified his target, Joseph Merlin, a man who hadn't received a single promotion or reward in 30 years. Such a person could only be one of two things: either incompetent, or simply unbearable to others. When they knocked on Merlin's door, he was too busy with paperwork to even lift his head. Precisely the kind of man Edouard had in mind for his plan. A letter accusing Captain Pradelle was slipped into Merlin's office, and he quickly drove out to the still unopened cemetery. Captain Pradell hadn't just buried martyrs haphazardly, he had also been cutting corners on coffins, stuffing average-height soldiers of 1.7 meters into 1.5-meter boxes. It was estimated that each coffin earned him at least 5 francs in profit. When Merlin pried open the coffins, he found few intact bodies, mostly mangled remains. To Pradell, corpses were just products to be sliced and packaged. Merlin opened coffin after coffin, taking photos as evidence. He had once felt indifferent to war. The worst it had done was raise the price of his favorite meats. But now, with the remains of martyrs before him, his chest was churning with emotion. He knew, no matter the cost, he had to shatter the facade and expose society's twisted core, until he found a coffin stuffed with cash. 100,000 francs. His monthly salary was 1,000. 10 years of reports couldn't match one day of Pradell's bribe. From a distance, the trio watched it all. Edouard wore a new old mask, one that bore the complete likeness of his own face. His art was no longer dull. He painted Madeleine's portrait with breathtaking talent, knowing he couldn't save himself from hell, but determined to redeem his sister's life from shame. Meanwhile, the bidding for the monument began. Edouard's father found the entries tasteless and uninspired until he looked through a magnifying glass and saw a familiar signature. It was Edouard's unique stamp. He immediately asked to meet the designer listed as a public representative named Jules. But Jules was a fake name Edouard had picked at random, knowing no one would check. And even if they did, they'd find nothing. His father realized he'd been conned. Albert, unaware of the danger closing in, was falling in love. The woman was Pauline, the maid who had poured him wine at Edouard's house without judging his poverty. He began grooming himself, dressing well, creating coincidental encounters with Pauline. His sincerity and kindness quickly won her heart, and he finally felt that life could be good if one simply cared enough. Edouard, on the other hand, moved into a luxury hotel suite. Parties every day, wine and morphine numbing the emptiness in his life. It had become an inevitable addiction. He even invented a drinking game.
Pour avoir déclenché la guerre, pour ne pas l'avoir empêchée, pour avoir aimé la faire, pour en avoir profité, vous êtes tous condamnés à mort. Exécution!
One that included his own father among the judged. After the revelry, he hugged Albert tightly, his comrade, his family, his closest friend, his partner in crime. With Bastille Day approaching, the three began planning their escape. Albert fantasized about his new life overseas. Edouard remained detached. What tormented him wasn't his scarred face, but the sorrow that had taken over his entire soul. Inspector Merlin, just as Edouard had predicted, turned in the 100,000 francs as evidence, sealing Pradell's fate in disgrace. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. Merlin had remained invisible for over 30 years for this one moment. He didn't live for a day's glory, but for a lifetime's justice. Captain Pradell got the news just as he was leaving his mistress's house. His only thought was to beg Madeleine, so she would beg her father.
Je t'ai épousé parce que j'avais besoin de toi. Il me fallait un nom. Je commençais à vieillir. J'étais fière de te présenter à mes amis, jusqu'à ce que tu couches avec. Mais maintenant ton travail est fini. Je suis sûre que tu m'as fait un beau bébé.
Madeleine had once truly loved her husband, but now, with wealth, power, and fame in hand, her love gone, her husband was just another burden, a job she gave to a beggar. Pradell couldn't understand. Everyone was profiting off the war, so why was he the only one caught? He cursed the unfairness of the world. Madeleine's father, however, took action. With a single phone call, he could make all the evidence disappear under one condition: find the artist who had conned him out of 150,000 francs. He could not stand the shame of being publicly deceived. As expected, Pradell found Edouard's hotel within a day. With Edouard's intelligence, he wouldn't normally create such a sloppy scam unless he never planned to hide in the first place. Pradell rushed to claim credit. The father made one call to the minister, and all of Merlin's evidence was wiped. Pradell walked free again. The father warned him not to sully the family name with dirty business. Pradell didn't even respond. He picked up his bag and left in swagger. Though the father was a lion of industry, he was old and fading, not worth fearing. Albert, too, sensed danger. The monument scam had hit the papers. All of France was in an uproar. Pauline, afraid he'd be hurt by the public backlash, comforted him, saying the scammers would surely be caught. And that scammer, finally overwhelmed by guilt, confessed to conning the entire nation. At the worst possible moment, he pulled out a bag of cash and proposed to Pauline, inviting her to flee to Africa and grow cocoa with him. As expected, Pauline rejected him. Albert could only walk her home. Outside the mansion, Pradell stepped out and casually harassed her, wiping away her tears and licking the residue from his fingers. Albert had always been honest and timid, but life never lacks moments that call for bravery. He followed Pradell to the cemetery, pulled a gun and aimed it at him.
Allez, posez ça, Maillard. Posez ça tout de suite. La guerre est finie, Maillard.
Pradelle backed away in fear, misstepped, and fell into a sand pit. The quicksand began to swallow him just as he had buried others. Now he was being buried. Albert tried to save him, but it was too late. His bizarre death was proof that even God sometimes refuses to gamble. Albert, now a murderer, hid in a train station room, waiting to flee with Edouard. Edouard donned his finest clothes and wore a dazzling blue peacock mask. He was once again the brilliant, untouchable son of heaven, proud, radiant, unstoppable. His father came to visit, not to demand the 150,000 francs, but to ask why the signature on the monument matched his son's. With just one look, he recognized those jewel-like eyes. He had never understood others, nor himself. Edouard was physically broken, but the father was spiritually crippled. At last, the two wounded souls decided to meet in honesty.
J'aurais voulu lui dire que c'est lui qui avait raison de vouloir être ce qu'il était, qu'il avait du génie avec ses dessins et qu'il fallait vraiment être un sacré imbécile pour le voir. Je voulais surtout lui dire qu'il était mon fils et que j'en étais fier.
Tears welled in Edouard's eyes. He realized that this small shred of fading hope had carried him to the end of his 25th year. This time, the father didn't hand him money. He gave him a long, sincere hug, as if all the burdens had finally lifted. Edouard had gained the right to live his own life, so he turned without hesitation, leapt like a bird, and gave himself the ending he had always dreamed of. As for his beloved Albert, if they couldn't defeat the cruelty of the world, then let them both die, and meet again in heaven. Albert was captured at the border in 1920. Treason meant death, but the officer in charge of his trial was little Theroux's father. On November 9, 1918, Captain Pradelle shot Theroux in the back, sparking the battle and ultimately ruining Edouard's life, launching this mad and tragic revenge. If anyone in France had the right to pardon Albert, it was Theroux's father, and so he let Albert go in secret. Albert, honest, brave, deserved a noble ending. When he walked out of prison, Pauline and Louise were waiting. It was the greatest victory of his life. And as for Edouard, that fragmented soul, in life and death some bonds aren't meant to last forever, and don't need to. They would meet again, among the stars. I'm a film lover. Thanks for watching. See you next time.